Hey there, I am Ross Izzard, and this is the Backcountry Fly Fishing Podcast, where we talk about fly fishing in more interesting places. So last week we had a couple of very cool guests, aquatic biologists from Colorado Parks and Wildlife, who joined us to tell us kind of everything there is to know about high alpine lakes. So we went through how they stock those lakes, which is kind of wild, dive bombing them with aircraft, with Cessnas. The kinds of fish they put in the lakes, how they manage them, and really how anglers can go about finding these places, getting to them, and enjoying them, because high alpine lakes are a lot of fun. The fish that you catch there are incredible and often pretty unique. And of course, they're in amazingly beautiful places that are very, very cool to visit. So that was a fun episode. I learned a lot. I hope you did too. And it was great to have them. Now we are back to talking about fishing in general with yours truly. And my original plan for this podcast was to do a podcast sort of generally on fly fishing the backcountry in the fall. But as I started thinking about it, I realized, man, the fall is kind of a big time window. It's not a really distinct time period. It's actually sort of this continuum of late summer, early fall, mid-fall, deep fall, going into winter. And all of those time periods are really pretty different. They fish differently. You go to different places. They require different tactics, different gear. And it just doesn't really make sense to do them all as a single unit, as if the fall is one time that we can pick out and work with. So I decided instead to go the route of doing a podcast specifically about how we fish each month of the fall. Starting obviously with September. It is September 13th today, so we are past Labor Day. We are into fall, somewhat officially at this stage, but we're still in that sort of overlapping section of the Venn diagram where it's still pretty warm. It still kind of feels like summer, but there's a little bit of a bite in the air. The leaves are starting to change just a little bit, and it's definitely that time of year. So we're kind of just coming into it, and I want to just start there. So let's talk about not what it means to fly fish the backcountry in the fall, but what it means to fly fish the backcountry in September specifically. So that's what we're going to do today. I'm going to walk you through where I like to fish in September when it comes to my trips. I will walk you through a little bit about the tactics of how exactly I go about fishing these places, what's at the end of my line, and all of that stuff. So the process of going out and fishing these places. And then we'll talk a little bit about some other stuff that you're going to want to keep in mind when you're out there in the fall. That's just, biological, ecological stuff that's good for you to know when you're out there. Let's start with this. You don't have to stop fly fishing just because it's now the fall. I know Labor Day weekend is kind of the cap of the summer. A lot of folks just sort of stop at that point. Or feel like they're supposed to stop or whatever. There are certain places in the country where you do have some closures later in the fall for certain types of fishing to protect the spawn. Colorado is not one of those. Most western states aren't like that. In fact, most states that I know of are not like that. So really, it's just more of a time of transition. You can still fish. You should fish. The fall, and especially the early fall, are incredible times to be on the water. September is one of my favorite months of the year when it comes to fly fishing. And there's just a lot of good fun to be had out there in general on any stream, but that includes in the backcountry as long as you're thoughtful and careful and intentional about how you do that. So let's start with where we fly fish in September. And keep in mind, September is sort of, it's the end of summer. In most cases, I have spent the vast majority of my summer hiking all over the place, maybe camping in a couple places, carrying heavy packs up the sides of mountains, 2,000, 3,000 feet of elevation gain, hanging out at 12,000 feet catching cutthroats or golden trout or something else at these incredible lakes that are miles into the backcountry, sometimes off trail. And I've usually had a really awesome time doing this. I've been to a bunch of places. I've been to dozens of lakes, maybe dozens of streams, and it's been fun. But I'm also kind of tired at this point, right? So I've been gone a lot. Work's starting to get a little bit busier for me. My kids are wondering if their fishy dad is ever going to come back. And I'm kind of, I'm slowing down a little bit after a great summer. I've crossed off most of the places on my list, maybe not all, but most. I made some pretty good progress. And now I'm ready to get back to the streams and some lower elevation stuff. And, there are a few reasons for that. The first one really comes back to that first guiding principle that we talked about way back on, I don't know, episode 3, maybe. And it's safety first, which, when you're talking about fishing, especially backcountry locations in the fall, and this includes early in the fall in September, you got to be aware of the fact that the world is changing up high. It may still be really warm. In fact, it's almost 90 degrees here in Denver as I record this. It's sunny. It's beautiful. The weather is perfect. There's a little bit of a, crisp in the air, but it's, for the most part, just a gorgeous day. Up in the mountains, though, things are starting to turn. So if you're at, say, 10,000 feet, it's probably starting to get a little chillier. Like you might need a hoodie to be up there and maybe a hat once the sun starts going down. The sun's coming up later. It's going down earlier. The temperatures are down a little bit. You're going to start to notice a little bit of a chill at that elevation. You jump up to 11,000 feet. Now it's probably pretty cold. Fall has started in earnest in September at 11,000 feet most years. And it's starting to get kind of chilly. You might not want to be getting wet. And it's starting to feel different for sure. And then when you get to 12,000 feet, this is it's a different planet now. I hear people that say, well, you have a whole nother month of fishing at these lakes in September. I don't think you do, to be perfectly honest with you. It's September 13th, as I said. We've already had 2 significant snowfalls in the mountains here in Colorado. Both of those started at around 11,000 feet and went up to 12,000 feet and even higher. They're not huge, right? We're not talking about a blizzard that dumped, 5 feet of snow up there, but significant enough snowfall that it was recorded, that the ski resorts got excited, that the news reported on it. It's snowing up there, and that can happen in September. So when you get to September, this is the time where you still are going to have thunderstorms in the afternoon a lot of days, and they can be normal thunderstorms like you have in the summer. Around 1 or 2 o'clock, the storm clouds rolled in, and it rains, or maybe it hails, and there's lightning, and you kind of don't want to be up there for those, as we've talked about before. But now, we've gotten to a place where you could also get caught in a snowstorm. It might be a thunder snowstorm, which happens sometimes, and it's pretty insane to be in a storm that's simultaneously a thunderstorm and a snowstorm. It could be freezing rain. It could be sleet or grapple, which is that kind of balled up ice stuff. It's gross, sort of sleety stuff that can hit you. And you can get caught in some pretty nasty weather in these places, which, it's problematic for a number of reasons. The first one is that you might not be geared for it. If you start hiking somewhere where it's, 90 degrees and you hike up there and then suddenly it's 35 degrees and snowing and you don't have the right stuff, you may be really cold, really uncomfortable, and it conceivably could get into being a pretty bad situation for you from a safety perspective. But additionally to that, a lot of these lakes, these higher elevation areas, they're hard to reach. Even if you have a trail going up there, you're hiking a really long distance, you're probably covering ground on a pretty rocky surface, even if it's a trail. You might be scrambling. You might be going over boulder fields. You might be having to do, stream crossings or whatever. They're not super duper easy to reach. The terrain is pretty difficult, even when it's bone dry in the height of summer. Once you add a little bit of slickness to that, so let's say this is, freezing rain that's coated the boulders in a boulder field, or just a little dusting of snow, honestly, like half an inch, if that, or really anything else, it's going to start making things pretty slick and pretty unpleasant. And you really only need to get caught crossing a boulder field with sort of semi-frozen water on top of those rocks before you realize that that's not a safe situation, and it's not a situation that you're probably going to want to have more than once. Same thing goes with snow. You can be sitting at the top of the mountain, you get caught in one of these storms at a lake, and you suddenly find yourself in some pretty serious and in some cases fairly violent snowstorms that, in addition to being cold and unpleasant, kind of ripping at you with the wind and the ice crystals, they can really decrease the visibility. They can sort of wrap you in clouds, wrap you in snow. It can get tough to tell where you are, tough to trace your steps back. And it can become a pretty serious safety hazard pretty quickly. Same thing if you're camping. You can wake up with a half foot of snow on your tent overnight. That's something that you got to deal with, and you may have to get out of there. All of these situations are things that can start happening in September. Now, will they happen in September for sure every September? No, probably not. Do they happen most days in September? No, not really. But they happen often enough that they've happened to me. And they happen often enough that I have learned that when September rolls around, it is time for me to start dialing back the elevation and the technicality of my backcountry trips. Doesn't mean that I stop fly fishing the backcountry, but it does mean that after that Labor Day weekend, I probably do my last big hike, my sort of capstone hike for the summer that weekend or the week before. And then I'm kind of done with it. It's time to start moving myself back down the mountains, coming down to lower elevations, and starting to think through, what the fall is going to look like for me. And it usually does not include high alpine lakes. It just doesn't. The nice thing about this is that it allows me to get back to moving water, back to the streams. Streams are the heart of fly fishing. I love fly fishing lakes. Stillwater fly fishing is great. It's a totally different game. I love it. I love the places it takes me. I love the fish that I catch. But there's just nothing like standing in moving water, casting to trout who live in the moving water, looking for that perfect dead drift, looking for that accuracy in this seam or that pocket. It's just a really special activity, and it's why so many fishers they really want to be in rivers. They're not really into lakes. Stillwater is kind of a weird thing to them. And even though I think that that's not really correct, and I think you're missing out on a lot of awesome fly fishing by doing that, I get it. I miss the streams too. And by the end of the summer, when early on, like April, May, June, sometimes going into July, it's runoff. There's snow melting off the mountains. There's a huge amount of water pouring down off the mountains. And it blows up the streams. I mean, they go from 100 CFS to 1,000 CFS, and they're just these raging torrents of death that you just can't fish. You can't fish them. You can't wait them. You really can't touch them for 2 months, maybe 2.5 months. It kind of depends on how much snowpack there is and how long runoff takes with air temps and everything else. But for the most part, they're shut down for runoff. By the time runoff ends, you have entered this sort of golden window for reaching these high alpine lakes. You're usually, let's say early, mid-July. You can finally reach these higher lakes. They're probably iced off. The fish have had time to do their weird pseudo-spawn stuff, and they might be ready to eat. And you kind of have this real short window to get up to those lakes in July and August. And some of the lakes, to be honest, you may have such a short window that it's only a couple of weeks. So, you really want to spend the time that you have to fish judiciously. You want to be going to these places when they're open, when you have a window to get up there and catch some fish. And as a result, you're probably going to be like me. You'll spend a good chunk of your summer months going after these high alpine lakes and hiking to them, which is great. I have no problem with it at all. But I will say, when I get back to my streams, these small creeks that I love to fish, and I should say that I do fish big rivers. It's fine. I don't dislike it, but I'm really a small stream guy, just in general, but especially when it comes to backcountry fly fishing. I love little creeks. We're talking 15 feet wide, maybe 20 feet wide, sometimes a lot smaller than that. Places where even in the summertime, you're probably not getting water much over about your mid-calf, and in the fall, it might be just up to your ankles. We'll talk a little bit more about water levels here in a little bit. But I'm ready to get back to them. I miss them at this point. I'm excited to get back to them. And for me, September is really about my return home, my return back to these small streams where I love to fish, and where we've really got some pretty good time to have some pretty incredible fly fishing. And it's time to get back to them. And I'll add one more thing too with the high elevations that you should keep in mind. Fish, especially brook trout who live in those higher elevations, time their spawn with water temperatures. Water temperatures at higher elevations, as you probably know or could surmise, tend to be lower than they are at lower elevations where it's warmer. And the result is that they can start spawning pretty early. I've seen brook trout spawning in streams at 10,000 feet or slightly over as early as like the first week or the second week of September. So they may be starting to get into the spawn. At that point, you kind of don't want to mess with them. And to be honest with you, even if you were unethically inclined to go and mess with them, the truth is they're probably not really going to eat anyway, right? Spawning trout who are busy doing other stuff, they don't really care about your fly. They've got other things to think about. Maybe you can make one or two eat. You shouldn't. It's not very ethical. It's not a good thing to do because they're trying to reproduce the next generation of trout for us to catch. But, you could try. You're probably not going to have much luck, and there's no point in doing it. That spawn's going to start much earlier at those higher elevations than it does at lower elevations, which is just one more reason to get back to these lower elevation small streams. All right. So at this point, it's good for you to have a list. And I actually have a list of places I want to go in the summer. They're usually lakes, like I said. But then I have a list that I've been developing over the course of the last year or 2 years or however long of various streams that I want to fish. They might be places I've been before. I prefer that they're not. I like to go to new places, but the fall is a great time to get reacquainted with water that you already know. And usually I have this sort of list of places that I would like to get to in September because I know that September is just such an incredibly juicy time to be on these little creeks. And when I roll up to one of these creeks, I go out there, I have my day pack, I hop in the water. I'm still wet wading. September, especially at lower elevations, is still warm enough for you to wet wade, so you don't have to wear waders. You don't have to do the whole, getting bundled up like the Michelin Man thing. You can put on your wading boots, put on your wading socks, put on your pants, and just hop in the water and wet wade like you would in the middle of the summer. But there are some interesting differences, right? You get in the water, and the first thing that you're going to notice in the fall on these small streams is that there are two features of the water that are going to be just immediately right in front of your face. The first is that the water is very low, very low. We're talking about a stream that maybe in the summertime it runs at 30, 40, 50 CFS. That stream might be at 10 or 15 CFS in September. And the reason for that is that there's just not a lot of water coming into the system at that point. Most of the snow has melted off the mountains by then. There aren't a lot of really big melting events still going on. The rainstorms in the afternoon have started to abate, both in their frequency and their intensity, so there's not as much rainwater being dumped into the system. And everything is really just quite a bit drier at that point, which means the water's lower. Those streams require runoff and entry points for other sources of water to maintain their flows. They don't really have those to the same extent in September, and so they're going to be pretty low. Second thing you're going to notice is that the water is crystal clear. And it's really hard to overstate how incredibly clear and transparent the water is in one of these small streams in September. It's like looking through a perfectly polished, recently cleaned pane of absolutely flawless glass. I mean, you can see every detail, every rock, every twig, every piece of debris, every log. I mean, you just can see everything in these rivers. And that's accentuated by the fact that, holes that you've seen before that might have been 4 or 5 feet deep in July or August, those might be 2 feet deep, which means that you have even more visibility down into those areas than you did before. And so you're walking in the stream, and it's going to be very low, and it's going to be very, very clear. That means two things to you as an angler. The first thing is that it probably means that you get to fish dry flies, which is awesome. I don't make any secrets about this. I love fishing dry droppers. If I could find the magical place where I only had to fish a dry dropper year round, I honest to God don't believe I would ever tie anything else onto my line. I just don't. I know there are other ways to fish. You can indicator nymph, you can Euro nymph, you can tight line various ways, you can run streamers, you can do wet flies. And I want to be clear, I do all of those things from time to time when the situation calls for it. But in the warmer months, when that water is low enough that the fish are close enough to the surface that they have this really juicy opportunity to come up and take the dry fly, and when it's warm enough for me to be out there and enjoying the insect hatches and the weather, I want to put a dry fly in the water. I really do. I will tie a nymph to it because I don't want to miss out those few fish who are too lazy to come up and they want that kind of easy subsurface meal. But I'm fishing a dry dropper like 99% of the time in the summertime. And in September, I'm really for sure fishing a dry dropper on these streams. And the reasons for that are that the fish want to eat it. That's why we do it. That's why we do most things when we go fly fishing. But they are really in the mood to be aggressive feeders in September. There are still bugs hatching. It is still warm enough. The water temperatures have come down a little bit from their peak in the summertime, which, by the way, has the added benefit of making it so that you don't have to feel bad about fishing in some of these lower area streams that may get to 65, 70, even hotter than that in the middle of the summer at lower elevations. Well, now those streams are probably like 55 to 60, and you don't have to worry so much about how warm they are and whether or not there's enough oxygen in there for the trout after you catch them. You can sort of just go fish and not have to stress too much about it. Insects are still popping off all over the place, and the fish are ready to eat, right? So if they're brown trout or brook trout, they're starting to kind of put on their tuxedos. They're putting on their spawn colors. They're putting on some weight. They're getting ready to spawn because they spawn in the fall. And so they're about to go do their crazy mating dance and their ritual thing, and that requires a lot of calories. And then for the rainbows, which, there might be a couple cutthroat, but for the most part, we're low enough in elevation in these places that cutthroat are not a serious part of the population. The rainbows, they're not going to spawn. They're spring spawners. So they're not, thinking about that kind of stuff in the fall. But they're hungry too because they know the winter's coming. And a lot of these creeks are freestone creeks. Freestone meaning that they are not controlled by a dam. They are just free-flowing, naturally fed streams. And they get really, really cold in the wintertime. They freeze up in a lot of places. They get extremely cold, far too cold to manage serious insect hatches. And there's not a lot to eat. So, the rainbows know that's coming, and they're ready to get in there and chow down too. And the result is that you have all these fish who are out and about. They are usually up in water where you can reach them. The water is low enough that you have this incredible opportunity to float a dry 4 or 5 inches right over their face and have them come up and eat it. And they're just ready to go. So when I get into one of these streams, I'm not even going to bother going to some of the deeper stuff, like those big sort of pools on the edges or in the bends with the big foam pads over the top of them and everything else. You can try it. I mean, I guess if you want to tie on a nymph rig, I can't fathom why you would want to do that when you could be fishing dry flies. But if that's your thing, then more power to you. You could tie on a nymph rig and try to get into those deeper slots. But the truth is the fish just they're not going to be there. They're going to be up in the riffles. And riffles, for anybody who doesn't know, are those sort of undulating, slightly broken places of water where it's cascading over rocks. So not like a full-blown rapid, not really full-blown pocket water where you have rocks sticking up out of the water and disrupting the flow, but those sort of undulating flows over rock beds where bugs like to hatch. And bugs like to hatch there because there's plenty of oxygen, there's usually plenty of sunlight, and so they're very active there, and the fish know that. So the fish go up into these riffles and they get ready to eat. And that means to the angler that you want to be fishing those riffles like a crazy person. I mean, you really want to be up in those things. And they might only be a few inches deep. I've caught fish. In fact, I caught a fish just this week at one of my favorite creeks doing exactly this in maybe 2 inches of water. He was literally so low that his dorsal fin was almost sticking out because he was just hanging in a riffle, chowing down. So you'll find them in the really skinny stuff. You will find a lot of them in the deeper sort of bowls and troughs in those riffles. If you look at one of these things in a river and you're reading the water, you can usually see that there's kind of the main riffle sections on either side, and they're kind of choppy and a little bit broken, like I said. And then there'll be this sort of smoother section with deeper water, and you'll be able to tell because the water is so clear. That smoother, slightly deeper section might only be 2 or 3 or 4 inches deeper than the other stuff, but there are going to be fish in that 100% because trout are lazy. Right? They are wild animals. They don't want to burn energy that they don't have to burn. And so they're going to find places in the current. They have to live in the current. They have to face upstream. That's the world that they live in. And they're going to find some place to sit there in that current and wait for it to wash food down to them to eat that requires the least amount of energy for them to maintain. So, heavy current, they got to work really hard to maintain their position there. But if they get into one of these riffles, and especially one of these little pockets in the riffles where the water is deeper and slower, since water is always a little bit slower down at the bottom, depending on how deep it is, they're going to sit there and they're going to just hang out in those buckets waiting for food to come over the top of them. And they're going to be sitting there waiting for you to put a fly right on top of them. I fished yesterday, like I said. I caught an insane number of fish over the course of the 4 hours that I was out there. I only had time for a half day, unfortunately for me. And almost all of them were up in these riffles. I threw a couple into the deeper stuff. They really weren't there. You might pick up one or two, but they know where the bugs are, and they're there. They're ready to eat. They want their fall feast, and that's what they're doing. They might also be in pocket water. So a lot of these streams are characterized by stretches of, relatively low gradient with these riffles and these sort of glassy runs and glides. But then there are other sections that are kind of classic pocket water, like boulder fields or rock gardens. And the fish are in there too. So they'll sit behind the rocks, obviously, in those eddies and those little pools created by the current break of the rocks. They'll sit right on the edge of that seam coming off the rock, so they don't have to expend much energy staying in the still water where there is no current, but they can dart in and grab a stonefly or grab a caddis or whatever without having to waste a whole bunch of energy. And they'll sit there, so they're there for sure. And I find that those fish often are opportunistic enough that when you plop a dry fly into their pocket, they hit it almost instantly. I mean, that thing touches the water, and they're hitting that or the nymph within half a second of it making impact, which is pretty wild and a lot of fun. But they might also sit on the front of the rocks. And this is something that we should talk about, and we will talk about more often. But whenever you're fishing pocket water, it's great to fish behind the rocks. You should be coming up from behind the rocks 99% of the time because you're fishing upstream. Talk a little bit more about that here in a minute. But a lot of people and a lot of anglers don't know about the physics of water in terms of what they mean for fishing a rock garden. And by that, I mean that a lot of folks fish the back of the rocks and they stomp around in front of the rocks, and they're surprised to see that they scared a bunch of fish who are hanging out on the front side of the rock. And the reason for that is that when the current comes up and pushes up against the rock, it creates what's called a hydraulic cushion at the bottom of the rock up against the rock where there's not a lot of current. And I know that seems odd because when you look at one of these rocks, it looks like there's a ton of current. It's probably kind of white watery, maybe a little rapidy. And it looks like it's probably not a great place to sit if you're a fish. But the truth is that fish will sit there because at the bottom of that, down by the base of the rock, there is a pocket and a cushion where there is very little current that they have to deal with. And so they can do exactly what we're talking about. They can sit there, expend not a lot of energy, and basically wait for this food to wash up to them. And they have the added advantage of being able to grab the food first, right? So all the fish behind the rocks have to kind of sit there and wait for the leftovers, so to speak. But these fish who sit in the front, they tend to get a good chunk of that food before it makes it further down. And as a result, I have found, I don't know if there's any science to this. Probably nobody studies it because nobody cares. But anecdotally, I have found that the fish who sit in front of the rocks tend to be a little bit bigger than the ones who sit in the back of the rocks. I presume because it is a slightly more advantageous position for them from a feeding perspective. Fish are pretty competitive about where they sit and who gets the best spots at the lunch table. I don't know that for sure. I can't prove it. I don't have a spreadsheet that demonstrates that. But that has been my experience. So don't forget to fish the front of the rocks, okay? You want the riffles, you want the pocket water, you want the pockets behind the rocks in the pocket water, and you want to fish the front of the rocks in the pocket water. And that's kind of where you want to be. Now, you might pick up some fish, in a tail out here or there and a glide somewhere in there. I mean, I'm not saying that there aren't fish anywhere else in the river, but the majority of your feeding fish are going to be concentrated up in those areas. And that's where you're going to want to focus the majority of your fishing energy. Now, here's something important. We mentioned already, the water is very low and very clear. And anybody who has ever been fly fishing for trout knows that those two factors, when you stick them together, equal spooky fish. And by spooky fish, by the way, we don't mean the Halloween variety. We mean the type that get super terrified when you get within 10 feet of them and run off down the river in all sorts of crazy directions to try to get away from you. If you've ever watched a fish do this, you know that spooked fish spook fish, which means that if I scare a fish 5 feet ahead of me in the river and he runs upstream into the next juicy hole or juicy pocket or riffle, the image of that fish fleeing in terror from the crazy bald man who's back here trying to catch him is going to scare all of his friends too. And fish are, they're pod animals, they tend to pot up, they school up like many fish do. And oftentimes, if one of them spooks, they're all going to spook. So if you spook a fish, chances are you didn't just spook that fish. You probably spooked that fish and half a dozen of his closest buddies and his cousins. And that sucks because it means that you can't catch those fish. And obviously, that's why we're there. So when you get into the river, you need to be aware of the fact that the fish are going to see you if you don't take the right approach. Trout have pretty good eyesight. It's how they keep themselves from, getting snatched out of the water by falcons and eagles and things like that. They're pretty good at seeing you, and they have surprisingly wide windows, especially in that really clear water. They can definitely see you ahead of them. They can see you on their sides, and they can actually see a pretty good ways behind them. They sort of have like the thing your mom used to say about eyes in the back of her head. Trout really do kind of have that. They have a really good sense of sight that, at least peripherally, will tell them where you are if you line up the wrong way, even behind them. So these fish are, they're pretty sly. And then on top of that, they have something called the lateral line. A lot of folks don't know about this particular organ, but it is a special part of a fish. Lots of fish have them, but trout have them, and that's what we're mostly interested in. It's a line that runs down the side of the fish, down along its flank, and it's full of pores. And the pores basically measure changes in water pressure and a number of other things. We don't have to get into the science. Maybe we'll have the biologist back on to dig deep into that one at some point. But really what it does is it detects shifts in the water. So when they can't see you and maybe they can't hear you, yes, fish can hear, by the way. They do have a sense of hearing, but obviously they're sitting in this sort of fast current. It's pretty loud. They may not be able to hear you. They can't really smell you because the water is flying by them and, carrying smells downstream and not upstream. But they can feel you. And so if you hop into the water in the wrong place and you're not thoughtful about where you go, they're going to get onto you. And when they get onto you, just because of the conditions out there, unfortunately, it probably means you're not going to catch them. Even if you have a perfect drift, perfect cast, exactly the right flies, you're probably not going to get that fish. So when you get into one of these September streams, we'll call them, you're going to hop in and you're going to have to be kind of quiet. Spend some time on the bank before you get in. I'm not one of those guys that believes that you can never get into a small stream because you'll spook everything. I've seen people give that advice. I wade small streams all the time, right? And in fact, the way I usually fish one of these is I will hop in wherever I start and I'll just fish straight up the river for 3 hours, 4 hours, 5 hours, 8 hours, however long I have. And I wade for a lot of that. I'll walk on the shore when I can, but a lot of these rivers, they're covered in high bushes and reeds and trees and debris and stumps and deadfall. And you can't just walk on the bank. We're not all of us are fishing a pristine, picturesque meadow where all you have to do is walk along the angel soft grass and listen to the wind. Some of us are fishing places where there's like shit on the banks. And so you're going to have to wait a little bit. And on top of that, to be honest, I want to be in the water. Like I said, I like wading. I like being in the water. I enjoy it. And so I'm gonna do that. I'll spook a couple fish, but I think with a few, tweaks to your approach, you'll be able to avoid the vast majority of that. So here we go. Here are the tips on wading these low, clear streams. Number one, fish upstream. I shouldn't have to say that because in general, with fly fishing, with any type of stream fly fishing, you're going to want to fish upstream anyway. It just makes sense, right? The fish they have to face upstream. It's the way they're biomechanically built. They can't really look downstream or they're going to get pushed back. They've got to put their heads upstream so they can maintain their position in the current. That, by nature, means that if you are fishing downstream, you are fishing in front of the fish. That's kind of like trying to set a trap for somebody when they're looking right at you, right? So imagine your neighbor. And you're going to set up one of those traps where he steps on a button and then a pie hits him in the face. And he's sitting on his front porch and you're like setting this thing up in his front yard, 10 feet in front of him, in his direct line of vision. The chances that trap is going to work on your neighbor, unless he is exceptionally stupid, and that does happen. There are some really, really dumb fish in these rivers and some really dumb people in this world. But probably he's going to be onto you. He's not going to do it. Right? It's the same with the fish. If he watches you walk up in front of him, even if he doesn't spook and run away, if he watches you walk up in front of him and throw a fly out in front of his face and wait for him to eat it, he's probably not going to eat it. They're not dumb, right? Trout have been around for a real long time. they're very, very well adapted to being selective and knowing when something's a trick. He's probably not going to eat that fly, right? So that's thing number one. Thing number two is you're not going to get a good drift doing that most of the time. Yeah, you could do like a dump cast. There are some things that you can do, and there are some situations, I will admit, where maybe it makes sense to fish from upstream of a fish. We're talking like 1% of the time. The rest of the time, just in general, doesn't matter what month, you should be fishing upstream from behind the fish. You should face upstream. You should point your body upstream. I don't mean you should be kind of upstream, like 2 feet upstream, but you're really facing across. I mean, you're fishing upstream. You're wading upstream. You're fishing upstream. But that is especially true in one of these backcountry creeks or any creek in the fall. The water is so low and so clear, the fish will 100% see you if you attempt to fish in front of them. If you attempt to fish from the side, I see so many people, and I did this when I started too. I would stand like right next to the spot I wanted to fish. Like I'd wade up to it until I was even with it, and then I would face the middle of the river, and I would cast a little bit upstream, and it would float past my body and past my midpoint, and then I'd pick it up and I'd cast again. That works sometimes, but in general, it's not the right way to do it. Especially in these situations, in these little low, clear streams, they're going to see you. It's not going to work. It's not the right way to do it. You need to come from behind them. That is going to offer the best chance for you to catch them. Okay, so that's thing number one when it comes to fishing these streams. Now, if you can avoid being in the water so that you're not making any noise, and you can somehow find the right angle that you can cast upstream from the bank without having to touch the water, without freaking the fish out, okay, that's good, right? If you can avoid disturbing the water, then I suppose that's probably better. But you don't have to do that. You don't have to be the guy that's doing the Pink Panther along the bank and trying to sneak along. Just be smart. Come up behind them, fish upstream. Don't splash and stomp around like an elephant. But, be smart about it. And one way you can be smart about it is to use sound camouflage for yourself, right? So this means avoid wading sections that are very, very still. So if you come across something that's like a mini beaver pond, or like a long glide, or something where the water is relatively still and calm, if you step in that water, you're going to spook every fish within 50 feet of you because they feel it through their lateral line. They might see you, but one way or the other, they're going to be onto you if you do that. On the other hand, if you focus on wading in heavier currents, so let's say now you're wading in a rapid of some kind or a heavy piece of pocket water, or you're standing behind a rock in a piece of pocket water, or you're standing in a heavy riffle. Those are situations where the fish are going to have trouble seeing you. Their vision's kind of distorted because they're in the current. You're in the current. You are having your noise, or whatever the crunching of your boots on the substrate down there on the bottom is being masked by the noise of the river, so it's harder for them to hear you. Their lateral lines don't function quite as well in moving water because it's not as sensitive as still water is when it comes to changes and vibrations and pressure alterations. It's going to help you kind of camouflage yourself. So you can wade, but you want to make sure that you're trying to wade in places where there's current. Be thoughtful about where you position yourself. Like I said, if you can hide behind a rock, that's awesome. If you can position yourself below an elevation change so that you're standing on that next level down in the river and kind of casting up over that into the next area, that's awesome too. You're kind of down low. They're not going to see you. These are all ways that you can sort of camouflage yourself. And they're going to allow you to be in the river. They're going to allow you to position yourself to get the cast that you want on these fish. And they're going to let you do it without having to, be doing like George of the Jungle, swinging from the trees on the bank and doing that thing, or acting like it's Vietnam and an army crawling through the bushes. So think about it. Be thoughtful about it. But you can definitely wade. And you're going to want to be good at how you wade, because here is the next tactical tip for you fishing these streams. You don't want to be making long casts here, okay? So it's really never a good idea to lay your fly line down over top of a fish. They see it. They see the shadow of it on the bottom, and they know that's weird, right? Fish are natural creatures. They're aware of the fact that huge pieces of oddly colored, rubber material slapping the water above them is not a normal thing. If they notice that oddly colored line happens to be attached to something that kind of looks like a bug, they're probably not going to eat it. So laying fly line down over fish ever really is not a good idea. But especially in these creeks, you really want to be making very short casts. You want to be close to the fish. So when I was fishing yesterday, and this is my standard setup, I fish a 7'6" 3-weight. It might be a 7'6" 4-weight. It's a Sage Dart. I will put in a plug for the Sage Dart. It is the best small stream rod I've ever touched. It's very arguably the best fly rod I've ever used. I love that thing. If I could find a way to fish that everywhere, or if Sage would just make a full fleet of these things, to be honest, I might just get rid of everything else that I have and just have a whole quiver full of Sage Darts. Not that I don't love my other rods, but I really love the Dart. But setting that aside, it's a 7'6" rod, okay? That means that it's not very long. It's a lot shorter than your standard 9-foot. It's definitely shorter than those crazy 11-foot things that you Euro guys are using. It's not a very long rod. And that's okay because I don't need to be making long casts and I don't want the rod to be getting tangled up in overhanging branches and other stuff. It's great. I overline the rod. I should mention that. I use a 3-weight rod. I think the Dart in particular does better being overlined, so I throw 4-weight Rio Creek line on that 3-weight rod. If I'm using the 4-weight Dart, I use 5-weight Rio Creek line on it because I want it to load quickly. In those little streams, you don't have a lot of room for a back cast. You really need that rod to load up super quickly on the back cast so that you can go ahead and get that fly out in front of you. I have a couple of others, including an Orvis Helios F 3-weight. I love it. It's an amazing piece of equipment. It casts beautifully, but it's just the slowest loading rod in the world. And that means I have to kind of have a full back cast, or I have to roll cast all day, which just isn't very fun. And so I like these fast loading rods because I'm making quick, short casts. Let me give you a sense of how short I mean by this. 7.5-foot rod, like I said. I probably only have about 3 feet of fly line out the end of that rod before I get to my leader. I do not have 10 feet of fly line. I don't have 5 feet of fly line. I don't have 7.5 feet of fly line. Almost always, I have 3 to 4 feet of fly line out the rod. Now, look, there might be a couple scenarios where I need a longer cast and I pull a little bit more out. There are definitely scenarios where I need a shorter cast and I reel some more in. But in general, it's a pretty short length of fly line because I don't need to cast far. And if you don't need to cast far, I don't need the fly line to push this thing out to 100 feet. I just need to push it out to 15 feet or 20 feet. And that doesn't require a lot of weight, which doesn't require a lot of fly line. I think most of you probably know this, but when you're casting on a fly rod, it's not the weight of the flies that's actually driving the cast out there, which would be the case with a spin rod where you're throwing a Panther Martin or something weighted. It's the weight of the fly line that is propelling these sort of weightless flies in the leader forward and then unrolling them onto the water and turning them over. You don't need a lot of that. You only use as much fly line as you need because the goal here is to never let your fly line touch the water in these little creeks. It's okay if your leader touches the water. A little bit of your leader is going to touch the water. It just is. The tippet, so that very thin, fine section that goes to your flies off of the leader, that is obviously going to be in the water. But these are really small, transparent, thin, non-splashy pieces of line, as opposed to your fly line, which is this kind of big, chunky, neon yellow or green or whatever thing that just doesn't belong in a river. And you just don't want that thing to touch. You really don't. And I've told people often, if you have to choose between making a longer cast to get to the spot that you want to get to, or just wading carefully, but wading more closely to where you want to be so that you can make the same cast with less line, you should always do the second thing. In these little creeks, less line is always better, always and forever. It just is. You want less line. And the goal is that when you make this cast, let's say that you've got a 7.5-foot rod, you have 4 feet, let's say 3 feet of fly line sticking off of that. And then you probably have about a 7.5-foot leader in your flies there, because you usually want your leader to be about the same length as the rod. You're talking about a cast that's 7.5 plus 3, that's 10.5 plus another 7.5 inside of 20 feet, right? And it's probably less than that because you're obviously not laying the entire thing out in a straight line. You're going to have some sag. That's all you need inside of 20 feet. If you are casting more than 20 feet in one of these streams, kind of in general, but especially in the fall, especially in September, you're going to miss a lot of fish. You're going to spook more than you catch. It's going to be harder casting for you, and it just isn't worth it. Make those short little casts. Hold your rod tip up, right? Don't let I tell my son this all the time when I take him fishing. Don't stick your rod tip in the water. Don't slap the water when you cast it. Don't lower the rod after you cast it. Hold that rod tip up in the air so that you're holding the fly line off of the water, and that will let you get that really nice, clean, crispy dead drift on the dry fly. Your leader can touch the water. You can manipulate that in a few different ways. But when you do it this way, these short fixed line casts, you don't have to worry about mending, which is a huge, complicated thing. We could do a whole podcast. And in fact, maybe we will do a whole podcast about mending. It's this huge, complicated thing. There are times when you need to mend on bigger rivers. That's true. Knowing how to manage your line and mend is definitely an important skill. But man, for small stream fishing, if you're mending, you're probably doing it wrong. You should just be closer. Make short casts, keep that fly line off the water, and you're probably never going to have to mend. You can tight line directly to the dry fly. So you could have this out there and just sort of hold the leader almost entirely off the water. So it's just the fly on the water. That requires a little bit more control on your part because you want to be sure to not accidentally introduce, some type of micro drag from you pulling on the leader or moving the rod tip. But you can do that. But you can also let some of the leader touch the water and just keep an eye on the drift. Especially if you're fishing upstream, you are going to be able to get some really clean, pristine drifts using these short casts with just your leader touching the water most of the time. And the truth is, a lot of these fish, if we're being honest, in backcountry streams, they can be picky, but probably not in September. They're not that picky. They're ready to eat. There's bugs all over the place. They might be getting ready to have babies. They might be getting ready to, get skinny and diet all winter. But they're ready to eat. So you want to have good drifts. You always want to have a perfect drift. But the truth is, you're probably going to be okay if it's not quite a perfect drift on most of these streams. And that gives you some room to wiggle on it. You want to get to the perfect one for sure. It's going to take some practice to figure out how exactly you manipulate your leader and your rod and your line to give you that drift with these short casts. But man, once you get it, it's so much easier and it's so much cleaner. And it is 100% going to catch you more fish. So short casts, not a lot of fly line out there. If you need to get closer, just wade closer. Be careful. And yeah, if you spook a fish, okay, you spooked a fish. Maybe you spooked 30 fish. That's okay. You don't want to be standing in one place anyway. I went to a event this past weekend and I had a bunch of people say, "Oh, you're a fly fisherman." I said, "Well, that must mean that you're really, really patient." I said, "Well, why would no? I'm the least patient guy in the history of the human race. Why would you say that?" And they said, "Well, because you just have to stand there and you're just fishing that spot. You're just waiting for that fish. You're just waiting. You're patient." And I looked at him and I said, I don't know how you fish. And I guess I don't know how other people fish. I guess there are people who just jump in a river and stand in one place and just like fish that one place for hours. Okay. I don't do that. I move. So I get in there, I fish that spot. I probably catch a couple fish. Maybe I don't. Maybe I screw up and I spook them or my cast sucks or something happens and I don't get them. And they all run off. And I say, well, very well. That sucks. And then I walk right through their stuff. I call it blowing up their apartment because I'm not going to catch those fish, so I don't care. And I go to the next spot and I fish that spot. Maybe I catch some more fish. Maybe I don't. And then I say, okay, very well. And then I wade up to the next spot. And I am constantly moving, right? So I want to get a couple of really good drifts through each area. I want them to be solid drifts so that I know that it wasn't a presentation problem when I put it in front of them. And then if they're not going to eat it, I just go to the next spot and look for the next fish. I want to find their, dumb brother who's going to eat it when they wouldn't. Or, maybe there were no fish there. Maybe there was something else going on. I don't care. But, life's too short to stand there making casts of the same dead water over and over again, or the same fish who's obviously not going to eat your fly. I get in the stream, I fish, I catch a couple or not, I move up. I fish, I catch a couple or not, and I move up. And you just want to keep moving. I mean, I must cover on a long day, 3 miles a stream, I'd say, doing this. I fish pretty fast. Even if you're not fishing that fast, you'll still cover half a mile, 3/4 of a mile, or a mile, and you're going to catch a lot more fish that way. This is why, when I tell people, I went out today and I caught, 50 fish, which, yesterday I did. I caught 50 fish in 4 hours, which is pretty awesome. That's a cool catch rate. You go out, you do your thing, and you just keep moving. Now, if you're casting to the same spot over and over, yeah, you might catch one fish, you might catch two, maybe you catch zero. But you are going to dramatically increase your catch rate by moving upstream and presenting your flies to as many fish as you possibly can. And that's not just a September thing, it's not just a small stream thing. You want to put the bugs in front of as many fish as possible because you want to give the maximum opportunity for a fish to eat the bug so that you can catch a bunch of fish and brag to your girlfriend and your wife and your friends. So keep moving. Don't stand in one place. Do your couple short casts, move up. If you spook them, whatever. There's probably miles of stream ahead of you. There are thousands of fish. I mean, some of these streams have like 2 or 3 or 4,000 fish per mile. Just move on to the next one. Let it go. Learn what you did. Try not to do it again, but move on and catch the next fish. Now, I know what the next question is going to be that you're going to ask me. You're going to say, well, Ross, what flies should I use? And we'll talk more about this often. I find that the fly selection piece is, in almost all cases, I'm going to say 90% of cases, the most overblown conversation in fly fishing. I have run across a few situations. They're almost all lakes. I guess I've seen a few very weird hatches on rivers where the fish are incredibly selective. And like, I've got to have a number 26 black zebra midge tied with a CDC wing to look like a pupa. And it's got to have a purple collar and the bead has to be brass and it can't be anything else. I've seen that a few times. Obviously, it happens several times a year. There are times when trout are incredibly selective, but 90% of the time, they're just not that selective. They're really not. If I'm being perfectly honest with you, I fish probably fewer than a dozen patterns over the course of the year on a regular basis. I have a box full of dozens of patterns, and I occasionally dig into them sometimes because they're being selective, but more often than not, I'm only doing that because I'm bored of catching fish on my normal patterns. It's okay. You can go out, you can try to match the hatch, you can look at the bugs. I think that's fine. But the truth is, in a lot of these small streams, and especially in September when there are just bugs hatching everywhere. I mean, you got caddis coming off still. You've got a few mayflies lingering around. You've got tricos. You've got midges, as always. You have like stonefly cases on the rocks where they've climbed up and popped out of their shells and emerged that way. You have hoppers all over the banks. You have ants all over the banks. I mean, it's a smorgasbord for the fish. There's just a incredible amount of stuff for them to eat. And the truth is, you're probably going to do fine with an attractor dry up top and then some type of beadhead nymph underneath. I tie all my own flies, so I'll give you the pattern names. Just understand that some of these patterns I've modified a lot of them pretty heavily, so they may or may not look like the ones you get in the shop, but the ones in the shop will probably work just fine, like I said. But I might have, like yesterday, I was fishing a Royal Wolf as the dry fly, and I fished a number 18. I will say that I do not like fishing really big flies a lot of the time. I'll fish a big hopper, maybe like a size 10 or 12 hopper in some cases. But in general, I do think, even though the pattern itself doesn't matter a huge amount, I think the size does. And I think fish in general, with some exceptions, I tend to have better luck with smaller patterns on some of these smaller creeks, which makes sense because most of the bugs are not enormous, right? So if you're throwing like a size 8 mayfly imitation, probably not right. You might want to downsize that to a 16 or an 18 or a 20. But yesterday I had a Royal Wolf on there as my dry fly. I very often have an elk hair caddis on there as a dry fly. Sometimes I put a modified elk hair caddis that I call Izzard's Hot Mess on there because it's this sort of weird, crazy mashup that looks like a failed emergence because I'm a shitty fly tire. Sometimes I throw that on there. Sometimes it's the old classic Parachute Adams on there. Maybe it's a clink hammer or a merger style. But for the most part, I'm putting sort of a big bushy attractor dry on there, probably in a size 16 or 18. I might get down to a 20. I almost never get bigger than a 16. That's up top. And then I am running about, let's say a foot, maybe a little bit more than a foot, 14 inches or so. Not much more than that because these things are so shallow in the fall especially that if you tie on too long of a dropper, it's going to get hung up. It's going to get stuck on a rock. It's going to stick on every branch. You're going to lose a bunch of flies. It kind of sucks. So you don't want it to be so long that it's getting stuck, but you want it to be long enough that it gets a little bit of sink behind that dry fly. and I'll tie on a size 20 nymph. I fish pretty much exclusively small nymphs, and by that I mean size 18 and smaller. And most of my nymphs I tie in 20 for Colorado. Uh, Almost always I have a Prince nymph on the bottom of it. The Prince nymph doesn't look like anything. It doesn't really imitate any type of bug particularly well. It's actually sort of a ridiculous fly that shouldn't work, but it does. I joke all the time. Fly fishing is a lie. We get so worked up about what type of imitation to use. For me, the answer more often than not is a Prince nymph. And so the Prince nymph is usually down there. It has a gold bead head. It's a tungsten bead to help it sink down a little bit more. I know there are people that are going to quack at me and say, well, you shouldn't have tungsten as a dry dropper or a dropper on a dry fly setup because it's going to pull the dry under. I haven't really noticed that because they're so small. That's probably true if I was throwing like a size 14 with a big old bead on it, but I'm not. I'm throwing a size 20. The dry flies are pretty buoyant. I tie them with extra hackle. I dress them with gink. I use the shake whenever they start to sink. I don't have an issue with it. If it bothers you, then do something different. But this is the way that I do it. It's probably a Prince nymph or a hare's ear. It might be a caddis larva or a caddis pupa imitation. Sometimes it is a little small stonefly imitation. There are a few different things on there that I could name, but I'm not sure it matters. As long as it has a bead head and as long as it kind of looks like a bug and as long as you're throwing it in the right places in September on these little creeks, you're probably going to catch some fish on it. In most cases, you're going to catch a lot of your fish on the dry. They just tend to be, for whatever reason, a little bit more motivated and a more keyed in to those surface level feeds. But you'll catch a few on the nymph, and you'll pick up probably, I don't know, half a dozen additional fish over the course of the day that way. You might have a weird day and all they want to eat is the nymph, and that's okay too. But there are a whole bunch of different ways you want to set this up, or you could set this up. But that's the way I set mine up. I have my attractor dry. Doesn't have to be hyper specific. I have some type of nymph underneath that ranges from super general like a Prince to really specific like a Batman nymph or a very specific caddis pupa imitation or something like that. You can definitely play the game of trying to look in the air and look at the bugs and figure out what's hatching. I do that too because it's fun and it's cool to learn about it, like I said. And with the guiding principle, understanding equals enjoyment. It's cool to learn about that stuff. If that's a good way for you to learn, then knock yourself out. But man, for the most part, get out there with your rod, get a little bit of fly line at the tip, have your short leader on there, down to a tippet ring. I love tippet rings. We'll do another podcast about how I set up my leader at some point. But I run the standard tapered leader down to a tippet ring. You don't need a special tied George Harvey leader with, hand-tied horse string from Vietnam or whatever. You can just use a plain old 4X extruded nylon leader, run it to a tippet ring, a 2mm tippet ring, tie it off. We'll do a podcast about knots at some point so you know which ones you need. Spoiler alert, you only need like 3 knots for fly fishing. That whole thing is also a lie. And then run your tippet off that. So you run about, let's say, 6 inches or 8 inches of 5X tippet off of that tippet ring to your dry fly. Like I said, you run about 14 inches of 5X tippet off of that down to your nymph, and you're good to go. And you're going to go catch a bunch of fish. I mean, I catch a lot of fish doing this, and I'm pretty convinced after being out there with other folks, anybody probably with a little bit of casting practice and a little bit of wading practice and some proper knowledge, they're going to get pretty good at doing this. They're going to catch fish. You don't need to overcomplicate it. It doesn't need to be a big, scary, intimidating thing. You can go jump in the river, do your thing, catch fish. That's what I do in September. So, I go out, I find these streams. They might be streams I went to earlier in the year. They might be places I haven't visited. I went to one 2 weeks ago that is off in this pretty remote canyon that you have to hike into in a wilderness study area. And I went back there and I fished up that thing all day. I didn't see a single other human being. Didn't see any other people anywhere. No even signs of people. So there's plenty of good backcountry to be done. You can get out there, find some solitude, have fun. You can still hike. You can still get remote. You don't have to. You can stay closer to home. That's okay too. But there's a lot of good fishing to be done if you're willing to get into those kind of smaller creeks and get after it in September. And that's typically how I fish through September. Once we get into October, things start to change a little bit. we'll do a separate podcast about fishing in October. At this point, we might as well stick with it and just do the full 12 months, and we'll just walk our way through it. But for September, this is how it works. One additional note that I will give you before we close out here, and this is an etiquette note. I mentioned earlier that at the higher elevations, you will probably notice brook trout starting to spawn pretty early, like first or second week of September. You know when fish are starting to spawn in two ways. The first is they don't want to eat anything. So they just aren't really looking at your flies. They're not interested. You can see them, but they're sitting on the bottom and they're kind of lethargic. They're not moving around. That's a pretty good indication, especially with brook trout, that they're just not looking for it. Same with brown trout in a lot of these streams. But the other way is that they sit on redds, and redds are like fish nests. So the females go, they prepare their redds, usually in fairly shallow areas that have a lot of oxygenation in them. They drop their eggs into those rocks and onto that gravel. And then another male fish will come, and the male fish fight over each other, and there's a whole bunch of sexual competition. And then the male fish drops his milt, his sperm, onto the eggs and fertilizes the next generation of trout, which then hatch later in the spring. Or later in the winter in some cases. But in any case, you can tell where a red is because you'll have a stream bottom and you can look at it. It usually has like moss and like the rocks are kind of dirty because it's a stream. But you can kind of tell it looks like a natural stream bed. And then you'll see these spots that look like they have been immaculately cleaned off by like the world's most powerful Hoover vacuum. They're white and they're clean and they're sparkling, and it honest to God looks like somebody got in there on their hands and knees and scrubbed them clean. That's because somebody did do that, and that somebody was a brown trout or a brook trout if you're fishing in September. It's a female fish, has gone in there, prepared the red. She has either gotten it ready and already laid her eggs, or she is hanging out on that red and getting ready to lay her eggs. But in any case, those clean spots that you see in the bottom of the river, which you should be able to see because, again, low and clear water, those are redds. Don't step on those, okay? Those usually have thousands, at least hundreds, sometimes thousands of eggs on them. Stepping on them can kill literally hundreds of fish that you or me or the next guy could catch next year or the year after that. Don't walk on redds. And in fact, I'm going to go one step further. When you're fishing in September, if you do happen to find a stream where you see those types of redds in the stream, or you see brown trout or brook trout are two fall spawning species, you see them acting like they're trying to spawn, just don't fish them. Don't do that, okay? Don't wade that section. Don't walk on the redds. They're usually clustered together. Don't get out there. And really, if they're spawning, if they're actively in a place when they're spawning, just don't fish for them. You know, if you're in a stream that also has rainbows and cutthroat, they spawn in the spring. They're fair game. You know, you want to throw on an egg pattern and go after some rainbows that are sitting there trying to chow down on the brown trout's babies. That's cool. I have no problem with that. But if there are no rainbows in there and there are no cutthroat in there and it's just browns or it's just brookies and you can tell they're trying to spawn, just go somewhere else, man. You're not going to catch a lot of those fish anyway. You just aren't. It's the way it works. They're thinking about other stuff. This is like somebody offering you a cheeseburger when you have a beautiful naked person in front of you ready to make love. You're probably not going to want the cheeseburger. You want the other thing, and that's where the fish are too. Just leave them alone. They're probably not going to eat it anyway, and if you can get them to eat it, it kind of makes you an asshole. It's bad for the fish. It disrupts their spawning patterns. It's not very ethical. And for the sake of the fish, for the sake of the waterway, and for the sake of the sport, really, because that's why we want more trout, so we can go catch them, you should just leave them alone. Don't mess with them. Go find somewhere else to fish, or even better, plan your trips to waterways where you know or can find out that there are other species of non-spawning fish in there that you can target, even if you do run across spawning populations of brook trout and brown trout. Okay, I think that about covers it for September. Like I said, if you want to get up to some of these lakes, you can still do that. Be safe if you decide to do that. Don't be silly. Be prepared. You can still do it if you want, but man, I really would encourage you to use September as sort of your triumphant return to the land of moving water, to these small streams that, before too long are going to get too cold to fish or freeze up entirely. Get out there and enjoy it. I mean, it's beautiful. It's warm. The leaves are changing. It's glorious. Fall fly fishing is absolutely off the charts glorious. So get out there, have fun, enjoy it. be safe, do your thing. Until next time, this is Ross. Maybe I'll see you out there, but hopefully not.